Hey everybody, welcome to the video. Let's go over the 10-game MLB DFS slate for today on Draftkings. But before we continue, as always, if you guys could just leave a like, and if you're new to the channel, you might as well hit that subscribe button. It's going to be all season long trying to help you guys become better MLB DFS players, and I cover other sports as well. So if you're going to keep coming back to the channel each and every single day, or each and every single week, you might as well hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss out whenever I post new content. You also follow me over on Twitter, I'm at ChrisPennell16. If you want to follow me on IG, I'm at CPen16. And if you want some more content over on Patreon, that's always much appreciated. We have over 330 members now, which is incredible. I do appreciate each and every single one of you guys. So if you're interested, you can hit the link in the description below. If you're not, that's fine. Let's just dive into today's slate. And also, fun fact, I already recorded this video earlier and posted it at 9:30 a.m., but apparently there was no sound. No idea why. The mic was plugged in. It just had no sound, so now I got to do this again, which sucks. But oh well, here we are. I guess I'll just be more ready for what I'm about to say, because I already went over it. But anyway, my first thoughts on the slate is that the pitching is horrendous. If you thought yesterday's pitching was awful, it gets even worse today. I mean, you have a spend-up option on Walker Bueller, who's by far the most talented pitcher on the slate, but even he's in a bad spot versus Houston, one of the best offenses in the entire league. So there's not a lot of good options here. So if you want to just pump pitcher, I get that, because it's gross out there. And if you want to spend up for the bats, totally viable as well. But we'll start up top here with Walker Bueller. He comes in at a massive price tag of $11,300. Vegas, he's got 4 runs against him, 56% chance for the win for the Dodgers, and 7 strikeouts, which is not too bad. But man, I hate this matchup versus Houston. If you're looking at Bueller's numbers last year, obviously they're going to be very good. In your 30% strikeout rate, 3.37 xFIP, less than 1 home run per 9 innings. But man, the matchup versus Houston, what gets me, and they got a lot of good righties in their lineup, and man, if you're looking at their splits, they have an 18% strikeout rate versus righties, 208 ISO, 343 WOBA, and a 118 WRC+. So, man, that's a lot to pay for a guy in one of the worst matchups you can ask for. But, man, the pitching on the slate is horrendous. So if you want some safety with Bueller, I get that. But, man, I do not like the matchup whatsoever. So if you want to just go with these cheap options, I totally get that too. And I'm not really sure where I'm going to go with pitching yet. I mean, I could be swayed by anything at this point, but man, it's just ugly out here. But we have the lefty Patrick Sandoval here at 6,600. Vegas likes him. Less than 4 runs against him. 62% chance for the win and 5 strikeouts. Can't ask for too much more at this price tag of 6,600. If you're looking at his numbers last season, he had a 5 ERA, but xFIP was a run lower. 25% strikeout rate, double-digit walk rate, and a lot of hard contact. So that's his one issue, is that he has a lot of walks and a lot of hard contact. But look, there's just not many options we can go on this slate, and I like the matchup versus Seattle. I actually think there's a decent amount of strikeout upside here. They did strike out over 25% of the time versus lefties last season. 110 WRC+, 330 WOBA, 196 ISO. There's not a lot of options to go, but Sandoval, he's fine. I don't think he's going to go too deep in this game, maybe around 70 pitches, but if the strikeouts are there, he should be fine. So I do think he's somewhat of an interesting option here. Then we have Jeff Samarda. He comes in at 6,500, and it's just a really good matchup against a righty, or as a righty versus San Diego. They struggled versus right-handed pitching last season, and every time they faced the righty, they were always viable, in my opinion, last season. If we're just looking at their splits, when it came to right-handed pitching, they had a 26.2% strikeout rate, 183 team ISO, 308 WOBA, and an 89 WRC+. Very good numbers for Samarda, for the splits for Samarda going up against San Diego. Now, Samarda's numbers last season himself were not that great whatsoever. He had a good-looking 3.52 ERA, which looks good on the surface. We had an xFIP of 5.02, less than a 20% strikeout rate, and a lot of hard contact at 40%, which I guess a lot of these guys allowed some hard contact, with Bueller at 41%, Sandoval at 45%, and Samarda at 40%. But I think he'll be okay. He's in a good pitcher's park in San Francisco. It's spacious. If he doesn't get murdered, I think at 6,500 you'll be looking good. And this is a good matchup on paper against San Diego as a right-handed pitcher. So I don't hate Samarda here, but again, I'm not excited about any of these guys. And if you just want a complete punt option, you have Josh Lindblom at 5,100. I mean, he was in Korea. He's been kind of just a journeyman, I guess. But he's in a good pitcher's park in Pittsburgh. Ugh, it's ugly. I do think Milwaukee could get him a win if he goes deep enough, which I don't know if he was going to go deep enough, but Pittsburgh's not the scariest lineup in the world if you're looking at their splits versus righties. Last season, they didn't strike out really whatsoever at only 18%, but overall, a weak team, only a 168 ISO, 324 WOBA, 99 WRC+. He's cheap. He's going to look good in projections value-wise because he's 5,100 and he's got a soft matchup versus Pittsburgh. And, oh, man, it's gross, but the pitching's awful on this slate. So if you want to just completely punt, I totally understand that with Josh Lindblom. But that's pretty much all I want to talk about with pitching because I'm not excited about pitching today. But I am excited about the bats. There's a lot of good hitting options, which we can probably dive into now. So at catcher, we have Christian Vasquez. He comes in at 4,200. And once again, the Red Sox are all pretty cheap here, and they're projected to go up against a lefty and David Peterson. Now, he's not the confirmed starter yet, but it's assumed that he's going to start. He has not made a major league start yet. Now, he was a top draft pick in their organization, but still, he hasn't made a major league start yet. So you kind of have to side with the bats here, especially at home in Fenway. So I do like Vasquez. He does have some pretty good splits versus lefties. He's got a 272 ISO versus them, a 124 WRC plus, and over a 500 slugging near 300 batting average, only a 15% strikeout rate. So Vasquez makes sense. He's 4,200. He did homer already so far this season. Now, I know the Red Sox have been struggling outside of that first game versus the Orioles because they've just looked kind of lost at the plate. And they did come alive a little bit late in the game yesterday, but overall, they've been struggling, but I still think Vasquez versus a lefty here that's never made a major league start is definitely on my radar. Then you have Wilson Ramos. He comes in at 3,700. And once again, I think the Boston Mets game should be a pretty popular way to go for bats because Matt Hall and David Peterson aren't really guys I'm looking to really stay away from too much, especially Matt Hall. So I do think the Mets make a pretty decent stack here. Now, there's no implied team totals yet for a lot of these games today, like the Royals, Boston, let's see, who else? Yeah, the Mets, and probably missed someone else, but not a lot of totals out yet, but I'd have to assume this game is going to have one of the higher totals on the slate. And if we're looking at Ramos numbers versus lefties, they're pretty good. He only strikes out 12% of the time, and that's really all I can ask for my batters is just to make contact and give me a chance. He had a 350 batting average versus them last season, over a 420 on base percentage, 151 WRC plus. Matt Hall's not the best pitcher in the world, so Wilson Ramos definitely makes sense if you want to use some Mets on this slate. Salvador Perez, he comes in at 2,800, and there's not a confirmed starter for Detroit yet, but it's looking like it's going to be Garcia here, and he's yet to make a major league start, and I think the Royals should be able to be one of the better stacks on this slate because they scored a lot of runs last night. I said I think that game had potential because there's two bad pitchers on the mound and two bad bullpens, and they went off, especially the Royals, and Garcia just does not concern me. The bullpen does not concern me, so I think you can stack up the Royals again, and the thing is, they're super cheap, so if you want to use an expensive stack and pair that up with some Royals, I think that's totally fine. Perez is going to be hitting cleanup. He homered last night, and I think he's fine. And he missed last season as well, and so we have no splits to look at here, but he's cheap hitting cleanup, and I think it's going to be a viable stack tonight. So definitely like Perez. He was very high owned yesterday as well. Then you have Manny Pena versus the lefty Derek Holland, who's a soft-tossing lefty who gets absolutely smashed against right-handed bats. If you're looking at his splits, pretty drastic, only a .051 ISO versus lefties last season, but a 324 ISO versus righties. Double-digit walk rate, gives up a lot of fly balls, over a 400 WOBA. All the righties for the Brewers here are in play. Manny Pena's got some pretty respectable numbers versus lefties last season. 250 ISO, 146 WRC plus. I think he definitely makes some sense if you want to pivot off of Salvador Perez chalk. Or if you're just stacking up Brewers righties. Going down to first base, we have Pete Alonso, who absolutely launched a ball last night versus the lefty. He's going to get another lefty here tonight, and he absolutely smashes lefties. And again, I think this game's going to definitely be a way to go for offense tonight like it was last night. But he is a near 350 ISO versus lefties, 141 WRC plus, double-digit walk rate. Now, he does strike out quite a bit, but the numbers are good for both sides of the play here. And Matt Hall is just not a pitcher I'm really that scared of. He actually gives up more power to lefties, but he's still got a double-digit walk rate versus righties, and I'm not really scared of Matt Hall, and their pitching has looked absolutely horrendous this season, so definitely have some interest in I keep wanting to say Mats and Steven Matz, but I definitely have some interest in the Mets here tonight. Then we have Matt Olsen going up against Antonio Sensatella, who just cannot strike out anybody to save his life. He's got a 12% strikeout rate versus lefties, which is horrendous, and only a 13% strikeout rate versus righties. So both sides of the plate, he just cannot get strikeouts. Does get a lot of ground balls versus righties, but I definitely like the lefties here versus Sensatella. Can't keep the ball on the ground as well against lefties as he can versus righties. Gives up over a 200 ISO versus left-handed bats and a near 400 WOBA. And if you're looking at Matt Olsen splits versus righties, they're going to be very good. A near 300 ISO, 150 WRC plus, and a near 600 slugging. So Matt Olsen makes some sense here. I'm not like all over the Athletics today, but I definitely think they are viable versus Sensatella, who's just not a very good pitcher. Then at 2,700 we have Jed Jarrett, one of those two. But he's cheap. He's a righty. And his splits aren't going to look as great versus lefties last season, but he only had like 40 plate appearances versus them, so you can't put too much stock into that. But I think all the righties on the Brewers here are in play versus Derek Holland, who's just absolute trash versus right-handed bats. But yeah, I mean, you can't really use these splits because these really wasn't that big of a sample size, but all the righties here for the Brewers are in play for me. Then we have Michael Chavis, 2,700. I am also tired of playing the Red Sox. I've played them pretty much every single slate so far, and they just have not been producing as well as I thought they would. But he's got some good splits versus lefties, and again, he has not made a major league start yet, so I think all the righties here for Boston are definitely in play. And I do think this is going to be a pretty high-owned game as well. But he's got a 255 ISO versus left-handed pitching, 85 WRC plus, and near 500 slugging. He's just a cheap option in the Red Sox that I do think is viable. He will be hitting near the bottom of the order, but I still think he's fine. He's also eligible at first base and second base. Then we have a couple of Royals to end the first base here. We have Ryan O'Hearn at 2,200. Decent splits versus righties. He's not like a guy that's great. He does strike out quite a bit, but he has a near 200 ISO versus versus right-handed pitching, and I think all the Royals make a decent stack here. I think they can stay hot from last night, and they're also all really cheap as well, so you should have no issue at all playing Royals. And if you're playing Walker Bueller, I mean, the Royals are obviously a way to go to be able to make that work because he's really expensive. Then Franco, 2,200. He went double dong last night, just absolutely crushed the slate. He was near min price, or he might have been min price. He was right around where he's priced today. He should be batting 6 around there, maybe 5th, but still I think he's going to be fine. Now, he is better versus lefties than he is righties, but no one on Detroit scares me whatsoever, so I think all of the Royals are in play here for sure. Dropping down to second base, we have Kesston here at 4,300. Now, if you're looking at his splits, he is much better versus righties than he is versus lefties. I mean, he's got a 120 ISO versus lefties, but a 314 ISO versus righties, over a 400 WOBA, 160 WRC plus. Much better hitter against righties, so he's reverse splitsy in that aspect, but I think all the righties are in play here versus Derek Holland. Like, he's just awful versus right-handed pitch or versus right-handed bats, so Kesston here does make some sense to me, and I do like the price tag, and I like all the righties from the Brewers here, so don't mind Hira, even though he's got worse splits versus lefties. Rougned Odor comes in at 4,100. He's going up against Merrill Kelly, who does not have a high strikeout rate versus left-handed bats. So I do think that makes Rougned Odor interesting because he's a high strikeout kind of batter, but he's definitely got some power versus righties. He actually has power versus lefties and righties, but numbers versus righties aren't too bad as well. I mean, 30% strikeout rate versus both sides of the plate, which sucks, but still has a 227 ISO versus righties. And if you're looking at Kelly's numbers versus lefties, he only has a 17% strikeout rate at 156 ISO, 325 WOBA. So I don't mind Odor. I also don't mind Shin-Soo Choo and Joey Gallo. They make some interesting options, but we can talk about them later. Whit Merrifield is also eligible in the outfield, but he's 3,800. He went off last night, and I could see him being popular here versus Garcia or whoever Detroit decides to throw out there. I'm not concerned with whoever they put out, but yeah, Whit Merrifield, I mean, he's got solid numbers versus lefties and righties. He has more power versus lefties, but numbers versus righties are still very good. He had over a 310 batting average versus righties last season, over 110 WRC plus, and overall, if you're stacking the Royals, you can't leave off Whit Merrifield, and he's pretty easy to fit in, especially at 3,800. I mean, the Royals make just such a good, cheap value stack on this slate, in my opinion, versus Detroit. Then we have Colton Wong. He's 3,600. Not my most favorite option in the world, but I do like the lefties versus Homer Bailey. Now, Homer Bailey's not as terrible as he was that one year. I remember the 1 year. I mean, it was just Stack City versus Homer Bailey every single slate, and it tended to work out. But he does give up more power to lefties, 160 ISO versus them. And Colton Wong's pretty solid versus righties. He's a high contact kind of guy, doesn't strike out a ton, and Bailey doesn't really get too many strikeouts. So Colton Wong at 3,600 leading off. I think he's an interesting option. I also don't mind Kike Hernandez here at 3K versus a lefty. Now, his numbers last season were actually better versus righties than they were versus lefties, but I've always liked Kike versus lefties, and he's dirt cheap at 3,000, so I do think he does make some sense. If we're looking at Valdez's numbers versus righties, were obviously the guys you wanted to use righties versus him instead of lefties. He got less than a 100 ISO given up to lefties, 24% strikeout rate. Now, he does walk a ton of guys versus a ton of lefties at 20%, which is absolutely insane. But still, he gave up more power to righties, less strikeout rate as well. So I don't mind Kike Hernandez. Going to be hitting near the bottom of the order, but he's only 3K, so I do think he does make some sense here. Then we have Jose Peraza. He's 2,600 going up against a lefty, and I've been playing Peraza a lot. He's really cheap, and he's just part of that cheap Boston stack. But if you're looking at his splits versus lefties, they're actually somewhat respectable for a guy that's sitting near the bottom of the order. He had a near 300 batting average versus them, only 11% strikeout rate. And if I can get a guy with a high contact rate at 2,600, I can't complain. So I think Peraza's fine. He's dirt cheap, and I do think the Red Sox will once again have some ownership. So he does make some sense. He did get a hit yesterday, which I'm happy about at 2,600. I'll take a hit. I will take it. So now dropping down to third base, we have Anthony Rendon, who is expected to make his return today. And good news for him is that he's facing a lefty because he absolutely crushes left-handed pitching. If we're looking at his splits last season, 301 ISO versus them, a 158 WRC plus, over a 430 on base percentage, over a 400 WOBA. And if you're looking at Sheffield's numbers versus righties, he actually gave up more power versus lefties, but still either way, I think both sides of the plate are in play here. Did have a high ground ball right to righties and didn't really give up much fly balls whatsoever, but Rendon's so good versus lefties, I do think he does make some sense here despite his high price tag. Going down to J.D. Davis, I do have a lot of interest in a lot of these Mets here, so if you're stacking the Mets, I wouldn't leave J.D. Davis off your stacks. He got some pretty good splits versus lefties last season. He had a 227 ISO, 139 WRC plus, 370 on base percentage, 378 WOBA. I mean, just solid numbers all around, and I am not scared of Matt Hall, so I do think all the Mets are in play here. J.D. Davis, one of them. Going down to Matt Carpenter, pretty much the same reason I like Colton Wong. Now, the only issue I always have with Matt Carpenter is that he tends to strike out a ton. I mean, I think we're around 30%, 24% to strikeouts versus lefties, and 26% versus righties, so around 25%, not 30%, but that's his only problem. But I still like the lefties here versus Homer Bailey. I'm not really looking to actively stack against Homer Bailey, but I do think like Colton Wong or Matt Carpenter are good lefty one-offs on St. Louis. And sorry it seems like I'm flying through this, but I already recorded this video, so I've already said all this before, so I'm kind of just flying through it just because it sounds so redundant to me. I know it's not redundant to you guys, but either way, we have David Fletcher here at 3,200, and I like him versus lefty here. I mean, his numbers aren't like insane, but he has a really high contact rate versus left-handed pitching. Only a 5% strikeout rate last season versus lefties. 5%. Guy that's leading off, he's cheap, makes a ton of contact. I will always take that because guys that make contact, it's at least giving me a chance. So I definitely like the contact rate for David Fletcher. I mean, super low. Now, Sheffield did give up more power versus lefties last season, but I still think some of these, someone like David Fletcher is certainly in play at 3,200. Should grade out as a decent value on this slate. Going down to shortstop, we have Ahmed Rosario at 5,100. Now, he is super expensive, and there's a couple of other value options I like better than Rosario. But if you are stacking the Mets, it doesn't make too much sense to leave off their leadoff hitter versus Matt Hall. He's got some pretty good splits versus lefties last season. He had a 370 WOBA, 216 ISO, 134 WRC plus, a 311 batting average. So I think Rosario is fine. Matt Hall does not scare me. The Red Sox pitching has been horrendous this season. I would expect the Mets to have one of the higher implied team totals on this slate. So if you're stacking the Mets, wouldn't leave off Rosario, but he does not grade out as like a top shortstop option, just value-wise, but he's definitely playable. Xander Bogaerts, I could see him being pretty popular versus a lefty. He took one deep last night, thankfully, because I had him and I was needing my Boston Red Sox stack to do something, and they were just doing absolutely nothing. But he got the homer, and a couple of other my guys got some hits and started getting a little bit better. But I definitely like Bogaerts here. He's got some solid numbers versus lefties. If you're looking at his splits last season, he had a near 300 batting average, 261 ISO, 374 WOBA, 130 WRC plus. I mean, at 4,000 hitting cleanup for the Red Sox, I mean, he's definitely in play. He's going to grade out as a pretty good value on this slate. Then we have Horey Polanco at 3,900 going against Carlos Martinez. Now, Martinez's numbers looked absolutely excellent last season, but also remember that he was coming out of the bullpen, so now he's going to be a starter, so we're going to have to expect those numbers to come down or up, either way, whatever category you're looking at. And the Vegas does like the Twins today. They're at 5.5 runs implied team total, which is, I believe, the highest of all the confirmed totals. Now, I think the Mets, Red Sox, and a couple of other these games could come close to that, or even if not more. But they definitely have one of the highest totals on the slate, and they crush right-handed pitching for sure. They're great versus lefties too, but versus righties, I mean, they're also pretty cheap. So I don't mind using the Twins as like a GPP stack today because I like their prices, and I mean, Vegas likes them, and I'd have to agree. And Horey Polanco at 3,900 just seems way too cheap. He's got some pretty good splits versus right-handed pitching, 207 ISO, 133 WRC plus, 372 WOBA, near 400 on base percentage. So I think the Twins make some sense, and he doesn't strike out a lot, only 14%. You do a lot of these Twins, so I mean, they usually make a lot of contact, and they definitely have some power too. So I think Horey Polanco is definitely in play. Then a guy I could see end up being really popular on the slate is Alberto Monteci. He comes in at 3,400. He was very popular yesterday. Didn't really do anything. I mean, all the Royals did, but honestly, it really didn't do much at all. But going up against Garcia or whoever they throw out there, I have no concerns whatsoever. I like the price tag. I like the Royal stack today. And he's actually got better splits versus righties than he does lefties. So I think Montesi's fine. Now, he does strike out a lot, but the guy's got some power upside, but he's definitely got some speed as well. So I like Montesi. I like the price tag, and I could see him being pretty popular on this slate. Then going down to the outfield for like the fifth day in a row, we have JD Martinez at 5,300. He's expensive, but he's going up against a lefty, most likely. Now, that's not a confirmed starter, but most likely he's going up against David Peterson, the lefty who's not made a major league start yet. And Martinez's numbers versus lefties are just absolutely insane. They're insane. He's got a near 500 ISO, a 540 WOBA, a near 500 on base percentage, 242 WRC plus, which is insane. A near 900 slugging over a 400 batting average, double-digit walk rate, strikeout rate below 20. It's tough not to like JD Martinez versus a lefty, so he is certainly in play for me as long as it's David Peterson on the mound or if it's just any lefty on the mound. So definitely like JD versus lefties, and I do think the Red Sox will once again probably end up being somewhat popular. Then we have Mookie Betts. He's going up against a lefty in Framber Valdez. Now, Mookie actually had better splits versus righties last season, but I still like him versus a lefty. I like the price tag. Now, I'm not actively looking to play the Dodgers on this slate. I'm just not that excited about them, but I like the price tag on Mookie. He's going to be leading off, and it's just tough not to like him versus a lefty, so I think he makes some sense. Valdez, they give up more power to righties last season, so this is a pretty solid spot for Mookie Betts. Nelson Cruz, I like the Twins today. Now, I prefer the lefties versus Martinez, and I prefer Cruz versus lefties, but you still can't leave him off your stacks because we saw that on Sunday. I mean, Cruz was facing a righty, but he homered off a lefty, I'm pretty sure, if I remember correctly, but he still had 52 points. You cannot leave Cruz off your stacks if you're stacking the Twins because the guy's just got insane upside, and Vegas likes the Twins today. I like the Twins as a decent GPP option, and even though Cruz's splits versus lefties are much better, he still has amazing splits versus righties. I mean, in your 300 ISO, 400 WOBA, 153 WRC plus, I like Cruz at 4,500. I mean, if you want to play all the Twins outfielders in the same lineup, I think that's totally fine. I did that on Sunday, and for the most part, it worked out. So don't mind Cruz, especially if you're stacking the Twins. Yoenis Cespedes, he's part of that Mets stack that I like today. Now, he has no numbers last year and because he was injured, but still, he's hitting cleanup, going up against lefty and Matt Hall. We know Cespedes hits lefties well. I think he's definitely in play, like the Mets tonight. We have Mex Kepler leading off at 4,200 against Carlos Martinez. Like I said multiple times, I do like this Twin stack today, and Vegas does as well. Now, on Sunday, when the Twins went off, Kepler did absolutely nothing, which was surprising. But you still got to like him here. I mean, he's good versus lefties and righties. He has a low strikeout rate, a lot of power versus righties, and your 300 ISO versus them last season, 118 WRC plus. So I definitely think he's a pretty solid play over a 500 slugging, going to be leading off. I like the price tag. I definitely think he makes some sense here. Eddie Rosario is pretty much the same exact play. He's got a low strikeout rate, gets a lot of contact, has good power versus right-handed pitching. Pretty much the same play there. I think they're definitely both in play. Joey Gallo, this is pretty much just looking for a cheap home run. I kind of talked about this with Rougned Odor, but Gallo's a really high strikeout guy. If you think Odor strikes out a lot, look at Gallo's numbers. He's got a 37% strikeout rate versus lefties and a 38% strikeout rate versus righties. But when the guy makes contact, the ball typically goes pretty far. And with Merrill Kelly, he's not a high strikeout guy. Only 17% strikeout rate versus lefties, 156 ISO versus them. Gives that more power to righties, but I mean, if Gallo makes contact, there's a decent chance this could go deep. And he's got a 20% walk rate to righties, and the guy's just got an insane amount of power. So if you're looking for a cheap home run, I think Joey Gallo's fine. But outside of that, I'm not really looking to stack the Rangers here really much at all. But I do like Ryan Braun versus the lefty and Derek Holland. I already mentioned it earlier, but Derek Holland absolutely sucks versus right-handed bats. So I don't mind Ryan Braun here. He's always been pretty good versus lefties. Near 300 ISO versus them, 136 WRC plus, only a 15% strikeout rate. At 4,000, I think he actually makes a pretty decent option here. Andrew Benintendi, he's 3,800, and look, he's been pretty awful to start the year. He saved his day with a bunt single and a steal yesterday, but outside of that, the guy just looks absolutely lost. I think he has one hit this season. Looks horrendous. Now, he's going up against a lefty, but he actually had more power versus lefties last season. And actually, overall, his numbers versus lefties weren't too bad last year. I mean, they're not great, but they're better than they were versus righties, to be honest. 170 ISO, 107 WRC plus. I mean, he's going to be leading off for Boston, which puts him in play, but the guys just look lost this season. But it's hard to leave him off at 3,800, and he's been high owned pretty much every single night. So we'll see on Benny, but if you're stacking the Red Sox, it's always hard to leave the leadoff hitter off. So he's definitely in play. Then we have Lorenzo Cain, 3,600. I just realized that went out of order, so I don't usually mean to do that, but it was an accident. But I like all the righties for the Brewers here. Cain's not a guy that has a ton of power. Only a 157 ISO versus lefties, but he's got speed, and look, Holland sucks versus righties. I know it's not the best park for hitting in Pittsburgh, but it's hard not to like the leadoff guy at 3,600. And I do think the Brewers stack is definitely interesting tonight, especially the righties. Then you have Horey Soler. He actually has a ton of power versus righties, and we're projected to see a righty on the mound for Detroit. And if you're looking at a splits versus righties, 318 ISO versus them, 140 WRC plus, and you're 600 slugging. He will strike out a lot, but I'm not scared of anyone on Detroit here. And he did went deep. He did go deep last night, and I think the Royals make a really nice value stack on this slate. So I definitely like Soler. Kevin Pillar, as long as it is Peterson on the mound, a lefty. Kevin Pillar should make the lineup here at 3,300, batting fifth, and he's been solid this year when he's played. Now, I mean, versus lefties last season, he was pretty darn good actually. He only had a 8% strikeout rate versus them, 105 WRC plus, 241 ISO, 328 WOBA. He's also going to be hitting right in the heart of this order for the Red Sox. And when he's played this season, he's looked well. I mean, he hit a home run the one day, then I think he had like 15 to 19 points on opening day. So he's been pretty solid versus lefties so far this season, going up against a guy that hasn't made a major league start yet. I think Pillar's fine at 3,300 if you're stacking the Red Sox up. Michael Brantley, I mean, he just continues to be too cheap. Now, I hate this matchup versus Walker Bueller, but it's always a rule of law for me that if Michael Brantley is this cheap, I mean, usually if he's like in the 4K range or below, but now he's in the 2K range and 3K range all the time now, he's going to make the sheet, especially versus a righty. Now, the matchup sucks versus Bueller, but Brantley's got super good numbers versus righties, especially for someone that's 2,800. He only has an 8% strikeout rate versus righties. He's got a 226 ISO, 385 WOBA, 146 WRC plus, and near 600 slugging. He had 19 points last night, obviously not against Bueller, but I like the price tag for Brantley, so I think he's fine in a pinch, but I'm not too excited about it. Then just keeping with the Twins, we have Jake Cave here. He's 2,700. He's cheap. He hit a grand slam on Sunday. Don't expect him to hit a grand slam every single time, but he's got some decent numbers, and I like the Twins. Vegas likes the Twins, and he's cheap. So I prefer just going with Kepler, Cruz, and Rosario and finding value elsewhere, but Cave's decent if you want to get lower ownership on some Twins players. Then Brett Phillips, he went absolutely off last night, as did pretty much all of the Royals. He's 2,100. Look, it's just if you want a punt option. I don't think you have to go this deep because there's tons of value on this slate, but Phillips is fine. He's going to be hitting near the bottom of the order, but I think all the Royals are in play versus Garcia or whoever they decide to throw out there because their bullpen sucks and their pitching sucks for the most part. So I like all the Royals, and he's only 2,100. But I think that's going to be it for the video, guys. Sorry if it sounded like I flew through that, but I already recorded this video once, and it's just really hard to go through an entire video again when you already said everything. But I do appreciate you guys watching. If you haven't already, make sure you leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you're new, and I'll see you guys in the next video.